comfortable and confident with the order you want to share things with us, please feel free.
Okay.
And so, hello everyone. Welcome to another series in our ArtEvolve bi-weekly webinar series now. We are joined here today with Curtis McConnell and Maurizio Saracini. And Dr. Maurizio and probably Dr. Curtis, I should say, sorry.
No, I haven't earned that right, so.
I am your host today because Mackenzie has gone on a last-minute trip to Vienna because I couldn't because of, COVID restrictions, unfortunately. So I'm your host today, founder and CEO Annika Eriksson of Articheck. So welcome. We're really excited to have two very prestigious and lauded guests with us to talk about authentication and advances in technology to improve how we deal with authentication. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting us.
It would be great to start off by having a little introduction to our audience, just in case there are any who are not familiar with you and your work. If you would give us a brief introduction to yourselves and your work, we would be very grateful.
Okay. Let me first share the screen.
Great.
You see it on your screen?
Yep.
I do.
See it.
Okay, good. So thank you for listening to this talk, and I hope that also what we will show you will be pleasing for your eyes, but also will be interesting to know. My name is Maurizio Saracini, and I'm a man of science, educationally speaking. I got my degree in engineering from the University of California, San Diego, and then another engineering degree at the University of Padua. And then I also studied many years art history, and I got an honorary degree in letters from the Canadian University. What I would like to tell you, since my job has been to study works of art using science, first of all, the idea that what science can do will be presented later on, but in simple terms, first I would like to make a short introduction of what I've been doing, and then some of the key points that will make you understand that the major difference between authentication versus attribution, and the problems that today the art market has due to this lack of coherence of distinction between these two terms, that has really made the art market a market or a world, I should rather say, because the problems are everywhere the same, with no rules. And consequently, we hear every day problems related to forgeries, problems related to crimes of other sorts like money laundering, and basically all rotates around the attribution, as if this attribution could be something that only few elected people can do, or they have the wisdom or the knowledge or the special eye to be able to tell who made which work of art. I'd like to address these issues, first of all, in terms of basic, let's say, limitations that this idea of the attribution brings to the art market, and then to make a distinction between what really is and what is not attribution, and what is instead authentication, and how these two terms are totally different. First, let me show you some of my early works of art that I've examined way back since 1980. I started in 1977, but let's say this was a major breakthrough when I got the privilege to study the Botticelli allegory of spring. And when I say study, I mean to use the technology that either was available, some of it I used to make it myself, to get a full understanding, or at least to the best of our knowledge and possibilities, scientific possibilities at that time available, of how a work of art was made, so technique and materials, and display with imaging, and then proved or identified with chemical analysis.
I have to say, well, this is one of my favorite paintings personally.
Well, try to imagine to be just standing in front, not in a museum, but you have it for yourself for months. And every day you say, well, I go to work. Well, actually, you go and study this incredible masterpiece, as it was
right?
never done before. But at the same time, you have a big responsibility, because you are challenging not only an unknown territory, really, but also you're trying to understand or to unveil some of the secrets of this, one of the greatest artists of the Renaissance. So I must say it was quite a task. At the same time, I felt honored to have such a privilege that I would never forget in my life. Now, next to it, you see a couple of years later, I was studying the Last Supper. And this is already a time when you might see on the top of the screen or the image, there is a sort of a clean area. But I started a couple of years before the restoration started, and the goal was really to gather as much knowledge, try to understand how could we peer through layers and layers of materials being added, decay processes, and try to find a way to tell which was Leonardo, or how much was left, and what was instead being added or repainted later. Unfortunately, this was not, I could not fulfill this desire, and also I would say this, what I thought at that time, an absolute necessity before studying the restoration. But in any case, it was again another incredible experience. And I simply think that that taught me one of the first lessons about restoration versus conservation. That's another big issue that I don't know if we'll have time to go through. But let's say that too often we tend to identify the two terms as one. That is, restoration and conservation is the same thing. No, conservation is like medicine. Restoration is like surgery. So you do surgery only when you cannot do anything else. But for what? Just for the pleasure of our eyes, to improve what you can see, or rather instead be focused first on how to slow down the decay process of the work that you have the duty to preserve and to conserve. So I realized that throughout the years, not only here in Italy, but just about everywhere, conservation is basically the conservation department today in a museum. You find restorers. That's the name of the game. Okay, and that's what they do. They restore, they clean up. But I think instead I would like to see the conservation department, conservators that can focus on conserving works of art without, I repeat, without even touching the work of art, and leave that as the last resort, as I usually say.
I would say, I have to interject, because I am a trained conservator, and I was trained in the United Kingdom, and my impression is that this balance, this is a kind of constant balancing act, and there is like a pendulum swing as well of like popularity of how one thinks of these things ethically, and it's a very important, critical question And I think my impression is that in the UK, there is more of a tendency to, preservation is very popular as a study, and non-intervention and everything being fully reversible. And I think that this is only, increasing with time. But I think it's different in different kind of geographic locations, isn't it? A little bit.
Well, let's say, I think would be needed if these issues could be addressed more broadly, since, as you mentioned, things are not the same in every country we go. But basically, we should remember that restoring, in any case, unless it's really a really damaged work of art, I think how to, as I said before, to slow down the decay process should be the number one priority, versus how much you can see beyond that, oxidized layers of varnish or dirt or repaints. So it's always evaluation for every case, if it's so. But I think that what is missing, at least I can say here, and I don't want to generalize because I'm not aware if this is really throughout many other countries, but I think if there was just a rule where you, before even considering to do even a cleaning on a work of art, science could study in depth the work of art, collect all the knowledge possible on the work of art, not only the anatomy, but also all the possible pathologies, collect all the knowledge about the possible threats given by light, heat, and the environment, microclimate, as well as exposure to visitors and so forth. Once you get all that knowledge, and I call it, once you compile the clinical chart of the work of art, then and only then you have the real down-to-earth knowledge. What is the best way to go by? Where nothing could be excluded, like for a checkup on a patient. But at the same time, you start with a checkup, and then you decide if you go to surgery, if you go to a pharmaceutical treatment, or rather simply you change your lifestyle. And this is, I wish this could become the rule for every work of art. We should have a clinical chart. And then from there, update it to the point when whatever intervention will be needed, because it's proven by facts and not by the decision of single individuals. Often, I'm sorry to say, at least from my experience, sometimes driven by the fact that there is a big sponsor, by the fact that the other type of pressures, they're not related to the well-being of the work of art. Let's put it this way.
I think that is a very good and astute point, and actually something that I was just going to bring up myself is that one of my feelings that is in terms of the future and what would be a wonderful tool and asset for people in charge of looking after our treasures is to give them the tools to do that, but also particularly around preservation in terms of like, let's do things for the collection that's helpful for everything in the collection, right? Even that maybe is even more important than intervening with one object, right? If we have 100,000 things in our collection, maybe we should really focus on, the environment being exactly right, or the storage, but the problem, of course, is that people feel traditionally that sponsors don't want to sponsor storage, and they don't want to sponsor, preservation because it's not sexy enough, right? And so this is one of the things that we have to overcome. And I personally believe, and there was an article written about this about a decade ago by the ex-president of the American Art Museum Directors Association, Maxwell Anderson, I think is his name, and it was about metrics in art and the fact that museum professionals need to decide what their metrics of success should be, and they need to be more proactive about presenting patrons with basically making these things sexy is what it
well
was.
I would dare I interject, from a technology standpoint, one of the things that has moved forward and probably a good use of technology is the ability to digitally restore without having to make any changes. Examples of early augmented reality I thought were sort of a travesty, whereas the opportunity to show both, what it was in its original form as it was being painted, how it's changed over the years, is an opportunity to sort of give a window to the soul of the painting without necessarily, corrupting. And there's enough, horrible, horror stories of people that basically have bad plastic surgery, and the equivalent exists in the art world, right? It'd be much better to see what your intent was before you do it, and then question, do I even need to do it, because what's the value? And dare I say, the looser definition of authenticity is gaining traction over the years, which says I think people have a greater appetite for watching things age gracefully, for seeing cultural heritage in its current form, while also being able to see, where it's been and how it got from there to here. So, I think, I don't want to completely, interject on all of this, but I think this is a conversation that, Maurizio and I have had, as long as I've known him. And I think, as you say, Annika, it's gaining traction. And when you talk to a lot of people out there, I think it sort of probably has the majority of people feeling this way. It's now almost the insiders for us to show that there's options, right? There are different things that can be done. And the amount of interest that even exists, that I've seen, is in people seeing the process. Often the conservation is behind the scenes and nobody sees it. I actually think it's an exhibition unto itself. The amount of times that I've watched Maurizio work, I think it's an exhibition unto itself. It's fascinating, it's intriguing, it's amazing, and it's part of the storytelling. And I think we've sort of, there's a resurgence in retelling the story and telling the story that people, want to hear. And it's not the same story for everybody. Anyway.
I totally agree. And in fact, I think that's a good point to bring up, is that in our partnership that we're looking at, that's exactly what we want to do, right? We want to bring elements together to better tell a story, to enable collection managers and conservators and people who are wanting to do these kinds of projects to, kind of have a better, sexier story for those patrons, right? Look at this amazing thing that we can do. And also potentially micro donations, opening it up to kind of democratizing and allowing normal people to maybe contribute to a very interesting conservation project.
Well, I think you touched before an issue that, as I mentioned, I have experienced many times, where the role of the sponsor sometimes is prevailing over other more important factors like conservation or need to do restoration at all. So I think what you just said, it's a really good point, in the sense that if instead sponsorship could change the way we understand it today, and could be the sponsorship of people, then this not only would broaden the interest, the participation, but we should make sponsorship, public sponsorship for conservation, whatever it takes. Whatever it takes. It could be for 10 years conservation, that is microclimate, new lighting system, protections, whatever, checking systematically if there are some mechanical displacements versus any other issue that could impact with the conservation of the surface or the color, the fading of the colors and so forth. There is a lot of science that could be generated, or let me say in one word, a methodology could be then developed if there was a participation, a public participation for conservation, rather than making the event when the piece will be restored, cocktail party, a big party, and then everything goes to normal. I think that's, again, is something that we should seriously think to stop this, and to instead engage and encourage people, as you said, even with £1 or €1, it's fine. But they feel that they're doing something and they're associated to a masterpiece. This, after all, it should be the future of sponsorship. We should stop with the major sponsorship just to make publicity for them. And very often, as I said, hardly, and I speak for my own experience, I'm not generalizing here, hardly they don't care about all the science before, as if the decision is made because there is a big sponsor willing to pay a lot of money.
Right.
And that again, it doesn't go together with the idea of what conservation should be all about. And even more so, restoration should be all about. Okay.
I agree.
Moving forward with other works of art I had the privilege to study. In '84, there was a major exhibition in Florence of Raphael, and then '89, the Annunciation, and then again the David, obviously, in 1986, which, by the way, is a passionate risk, even though not too many people know about it. And the risk is some cracks just on the lower part of the trunk, holding together one piece, the right leg.
Wow.
That could be an interesting story to talk about. And very often, again, this is a typical case where the work of art was cleaned up, okay? Literally, very carefully, no, absolutely, a real good job was done. But the issue here was not necessarily to clean the dust, it was if we have an earthquake, what will happen to the statue?
Right.
So again, because there were other interests, as I said, these interests prevailed on the real issues of conservation, which was preventing, and still after almost 25 years, well, actually longer than that, 35 years, as a matter of fact, when I brought this issue, and this issue has not been solved. So we don't know how deep these cracks go. And so, and this statue, as you know, is standing on a high platform in addition. So you can imagine, and the center of gravity is all shifted on the right-hand side of the body of David. So just to mention to you that when I say conservation versus restoration, I'm not really trying to find an argument against the two. It's simply, we should see first the overall issue of conservation, and then build up data, build up objective knowledge in order to make proper decisions, unbiased decisions. That's really my point.
Absolutely, and what a treasure trove of works that you've worked with as well. And I mean, and who really, I mean, in their right mind wouldn't want to, you know, contribute towards preserving David for the future generations to be around if there's an earthquake. I mean, sign me up, I'll give my micro donation.
Well, believe it or not, you know, in this case, what is needed is to use not necessarily X-rays, but ultrasounds, because it's a pure Carrara marble, and ultrasound will do the job to get you a 360 view of the crack distribution, and then you will have at least an objective understanding how risky this, the issue is really, and eventually how to go by to prevent further damage. And by the way, Florence is, and the whole entire Tuscany is a seismic area, incidentally.
Yeah. I think it's one more area, you know, risk and risk management is generally, people do a very poor job. They don't understand, they don't put value on it. I think, you know, for every time, you know, I've looked at the original imagery of this, it sort of blows me away that people haven't paid more attention to the risk associated with cultural heritage. And the only way I can conceive that we can do a better job is telling a better story, right? When you can show people what would happen, you know, under a, you know, insert a low grade earthquake, where you see what happens to that statue, it topples over and breaks at the, you know, at the ankle and falls and you know, it's on the floor and ruined forever. And this is not a major earthquake that could lead to that. But people have to see it, they have to understand it, and then they actually have to know there is a path, there's a way to address it or solve the problem.
Well, there was that big earthquake, right, in Florence, when was it? In the 1990s, was it? Or
well, we have a, let's say, on and off. quite a few. They're not major, likely, but we don't want to wait for the major one to find out that we might not have the David in one piece anymore. So, but this is just one of the many conservation issues that I could bring up. In 1991, again, I had the privilege to study. There were 19 paintings on display in the Sala Bianca at Palazzo Pitti in Florence. This was an incredible opportunity to get some good imaging of all these paintings. And that's the other issue, is to create a database that should be shared. Database is not only about how a painting is made and not about just the identification of pigments. A database is a concept that has to include also conservation issues. So all this should be available for everyone that is involved in the world of conservation, preservation, and restoration as well.
I totally agree, and that is again one of my visions with ArtEcheck that I was always hoping for, is that we standardize. Step one is like standardizing condition reports, which are very basic. Can be very basic or can be very detailed, but standardizing those, getting on the same page about those, building a standardized database of those with which we can then from there, add treatment reports and other kinds of reports, and also facilitate people to have, a publish button so that they can make a lot of these things available for research and other conservators, for treatment reports and forensic analysis, so that we can start to, really have some much better and broader insights into treatment, into, forensic analysis, technical art history, all kinds of, interesting things. The example that I always use is, imagine if you're doing a PhD on Picasso and his use of marine paint after the war, and how it degrades in comparison with traditional fine art pigment of that time period. If you're able to do one search that would look across, all the institutions that have Picassos from that period against, and then another search against, lots of institutions that have pigments of the same color, but from an oil paint of the same period, of blue or whatever it might be, and you're able to do that in 2 searches rather than painstakingly contacting each conservation studio for each institution once you figure out where they're actually located. I mean, that would take months. If you could just do it in one quick search, wouldn't that be just an amazing, fantastic research tool? So
you're pitching what Authentication is, right? That's what you're doing right there. And, well, that was literally one of the takeaways from years working with Maurizio at the Authentication Art Conference where we first met. Really you have to put value on data, and you have to raise it to a point, realizing that even though that people think that the audience isn't there, it actually is. When you value data across all disciplines, it leads to more participation, it leads to more interest, it leads to actually building value. And I think what we do is we tend to compartmentalize these, the value is, on resale, as opposed to value is cultural significance, or the value is preservation, or the value is, there's all these areas. And if we aggregate it together and make it easy for people to both collaborate and elevate scholarship, I think it becomes a game changer in terms of literally the position of cultural heritage going forward. And that's why adopting technology both from a scientific standpoint as well as a storytelling helps bridge that gap to really connect lovers of art, as well as researchers, as well as historians, everybody.
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges that if people could take away something from this webinar, what I would really hope that they would take away, because I believe one of the biggest challenges is that a lot of players in the art world, especially museums, who are often more traditional in their thinking and outlook, they have a sense that they have valuable data, that this data you're talking about does have value, right? And so they want to keep it close to themselves because they have a sense that it's valuable. They don't want to give it away for free, but then they don't utilize it. And because it actually only has value when these things do come together, it just goes unvalued and unutilized, right? So what people need to realize is that they do need to bring all of this stuff together under one roof in some way, so that we can, you know, actualize all of that value for everyone and build a shared economy, essentially, where everyone benefits from it. Nobody wants to cut out, you know, museums from having their share of the pie of what happens with their data, or any other player in the industry, right? But it's unfortunate that this attitude has prevailed, because it's basically meant that we don't have the tools that we ought to.
Well, let me say, since you mentioned it, why don't we start considering museum as a hospital? And you know that today the future of medicine is in sharing data, statistically, but not only just, and also to see how different pathologies are being treated, the results of different treatments. This is also absolutely needed, but as you said, museums need to understand that they have not only critical data, but they also should generate more and more, and that should happen for every work of art they have it in storage as well as in display, even more in display, but they should then share it so that we understand how a specific pathology related to pigments, related to binding media, related to light exposure, whatever, can be then how it's being treated. What are these issues? And that is augmenting our knowledge of conservation. So conservation cannot be a problem for every museum. It's a worldwide problem. It's a world problem. And the only way to do that is to share this kind of information, but every museum should have the responsibility and the duty, let me add, to study every single work of art and provide this enormous amount of data for them, for the conservation of their work, but also so that other museums could benefit, as well as exchange or get other data from other museums. Imagine how what this could bring also in the world of the art market as well, you know, where the database is the name of the game. Not only for the art historian, but also for the scientist.
Exactly.
And this is another major issue that no museum wants to tackle. That they don't even want to hear about it. As if, after all, most of the museums, they made their collections either through donations or simply because they bought the paintings. It's not that buying and selling is not part of the daily life of a museum. So there are so many of these issues. As long as we start thinking the museum is a hospital, and there is a responsibility. The visitors are visiting a patient at risk because it's slowing decay. At the same time, it's a patient that can reveal so much that we don't know about that patient. That should be known. The more we know, the more we appreciate it. The more we appreciate it, the more there is interest and awareness for us and for the young generations as well. But if everything is kept in a box, I think this is a very dangerous limitation, because we prevent to create the curiosity, the interest, not just on the millions of visitors, because they're not really doing anything other than bringing money to the museum. But we should provide them, while they are in a museum, knowledge, engagement, curiosity, and not just passive viewers as they are most of the time. That's also another issue that it will take a much longer time than we have now to really talk about it.
Well, I totally agree with you 100%, and we should definitely get onto your amazing slides.
I don't want it to go too off of the time.
A wonder wheel, but I do want to quickly say that what we are also, both of us belong to the Artwork Identification Standard Consortium, and this is exactly the problem that AIS is trying to solve, right? We're creating a unique identity, like an IBAN number for books, for art and cultural objects with a nonprofit organization in order to have an anchor point where in a space where we can create a shared economy and a search engine that will work for research, but also for the commercial world, for all aspects. It will bring new revenue streams for museums. It will bring much more in-depth research. It will be like connecting all of these hospitals, right? Which would be an amazing, wonderful thing for the market. And I think that, you know, the kind of data that you're collecting with Authentication is going to be a wonderful and massive contributor to the kind of data points for such a initiative. So
and I think it's a really key point that both of you have brought up, but it's really aggregating all qualitative and quantitative data. You know, and quantitative tends to be lacking except for these sort of small circles of people talking about it. But with the more contributions of it, the more it brings value. And I think you have to talk about value in multiple different ways, but value and how you measure value is the only way you're going to impact change, right? And I think as Maritza sort of points out, many museums are sort of focused on sort of legacy preservation. You know, this is what we have and showing it off, as opposed to what contribution are we making to the preservation of cultural history, or sharing that, or telling the stories that make it significant. And I think as that conversation changes, that's where you can have a massive contribution change as well. And what's interesting is if you look at the art market, the value often is in the storytelling. So it's not dissimilar, but there's literally a way to bridge these two together. And if there, you know, there's the funding resources are there if you can find a way to bridge it so people actually put value on good scholarship, they could put value on conservation, they put value on this, you know, there's a way, you know, that allows us to literally change the whole dynamics of how people perceive art, how they perceive risk, and the money they're willing to invest in really, you know, raising the bar on everything we do.
Well, yes, please go ahead.
No, sorry, I was just saying well said, but let's move on to your slides because this is tremendous work.
Well, again, I had the opportunity to work again on the Leonardo Annunciation. This time I brought with me some PhD students, engineering. They were studying engineering. They were doing their dissertation on cultural heritage. And this was from UCSD, the only PhD program that was aimed to create this new breed of scientists. And then, well, I'll be fast. The Adoration of the Magi in 2001. And well, that would be too long of a story. So let's simply say again, another big privilege. And then obviously the Battle of Anghiari, a long, long-lasting story, never ending, I should say. And now, strange enough, even though I'm here in Florence, but once a year I go to San Diego State University, and I'm giving seminars at this culture, a graduate program in Homeland Security, and teaching students, special students, FBI agents, policemen, and border patrols, and others similar, to try to make them a little more aware that investigational work of art, on finding a work of art, on identifying a work of art, on checking looted works of art, is not just a normal investigation. It requires not only a different kind of knowledge or integrated knowledge, but also a different kind of science in order to do that. So this was my background. And so now let me simply introduce finally the subject that I wanted to talk since the beginning. And that is, first of all, now I'd like to briefly list some of the problems that plague the world of the art market. And the first of all is there is a lack of transparency in the art market services. And I read it, so it would be easier also for the viewers to share with me what is written there. The art-related wealth management industry continues to grow and expand in investments. In other words, there is really no transparency, or it's hard to find them. Let's put it this way. And then the money laundering, as we mentioned, is another serious threat. I mean, somebody must start asking questions as, how come suddenly the cost, not the value, not the cultural value, the cost of works of art, they go sky high suddenly in a matter of 3, 4, or 5 years. Maybe because, what?
Right, I was just going to say, we have those new anti-money laundering laws that have just recently come into effect, haven't we? That a lot of players in the art market have not, let's say, been taking very seriously.
Correct, bravo.
Discussion around the fact that a lot of galleries will just put sales through their Hong Kong office in order to avoid them, for example.
Or put them in free ports, right. Which is another way to avoid those laws. And then undisclosed conflict of interest. It's another real issue, because we need to bring some rules really on the due diligence in our transactions. I mean, I personally have checked more than, let's say, a few times, forged documents for due diligence. Not only you forged the painting, you also forge the document, so you make a forged story.
I've heard similar stories from the Art Loss Register, and also the director at the museum where we met, the Authentication in Art conference 4 years ago, who made the talk about the Bugattis. He mentioned the same thing, didn't he, in his talk, that there were some ownership documents for the Bugatti that were forged as well.
And then, well, there is price manipulation, insider trading, other anti-competitive behavior. These are other threats that unfortunately we find so often. And as I said, there is this unregulated nature of the art market, because the art market basically doesn't want any rule. And then we will see how that is possible. That's my interpretation. Lack of management support, and difficulties in finding and developing talent and expertise. That's another thing, because anybody today can sell a work of art. Anybody can be an art dealer, and that's, I mean, there is no way to really check how professional the art dealer is or could be, or what is related to what kind of experience. Another big problem, like of standards regarding professional qualifications. This is really, it's part of an unregulated market, I would say. But then let me say about the attribution. Some of this, by the way, I also mention it, actually I show it also in Den Haag, if you may recall.
Yep.
The attribution, it's something that we should be aware that if you want to sell a work of art, or if you are an investor or you are a buyer, that you just wanted to buy for your own pleasure, well, for sure, you will look for the attribution or the top scholar specialized in that artist. In other words, today you sell or you buy a work of art because there is an attribution. But too many people don't realize that even legally, an attribution is an opinion, and is based on the competence and the experience of the art scholar. But for example, in Italy, you can make an attribution. You don't even have to be graduated in art history. Anybody can do it, because it's a free. It's
basically free speech.
It's a free speech, and then you cannot prevent from doing this. So as long as you find somebody who will believe it, that's good for you.
Well, there's also the issue, isn't there, that valuation experts, especially in the US, do not make that opinion, right? They make what they call an extraordinary assumption that says that this work is correct. So they won't even touch that. And a lot of people don't realize that that they have nothing to do with authentication or attribution. They are purely just giving you a value, assuming that this piece is correct. And in the process of donating, to US museums, you know, the tax authorities, they will have these experts, these valuation experts involved in that process, right, of donation. But there isn't anyone that's, I believe, that is involved directly in making sure that the work is authenticated in the donation process, right? I think that might be something that you spoke about.
It's shifting some, and you know, conversations I've had both at the IRS level and otherwise, there's a significant shift, including regulation, to change how that works. And if I can just say, you know, a lot of the things that Maurizio is talking about right now were brought up at the Authentication Art Conference, you know, 4 years ago. And literally, you know, that which could have been read as a depressing, you know, we're all going to die, the world's never going to get better, literally became sort of the inspiration and an aha moment in an airport for me that maybe we could actually solve all of these problems if we thought, you know, if we had a big enough vision. And if we took some lessons from other industries that had these same problems, and we borrowed both from them and also modified technology to help, you know, basically have a broad vision rather than trying to just tackle little pieces of it. Why don't we actually map out the world we think should exist? And what I found was, you know, it was surprising, you know, it was no longer a minority of people that were on the same page as, you know, Maurizio. And I think, you know, back in the 70s, I think, Maurizio, you were largely alone in this view of the world. And I think partially based on your work and the way the world has shifted, people are putting more value on truth, on authenticity of data. They're putting, you know, value on process. And I think, you know, even the art world has caught up in terms of putting a greater and greater value on research, and even the approach of scientific method as approach to how we solve problems.
Well,
and
I really like your comparison to the hospital and the, you know, the surgery and these different kinds of reports. I often make the comparison when talking about condition reports around, you know, having a survey done of a house, right? Of course you would have a survey done of a house, right? There's no question, right? And you probably would not even accept a survey done by the seller's, you know, person. You would say, oh, thank you, I'll have my own survey done by a third party. And it's amazing to me that, you know, this isn't standard practice as part of due diligence, and probably is the reason that we don't have more professional investors coming in, you know, because they do see art increasingly as an asset class, but they are scared away often by a lack of transparency and due diligence, as you say. And we have the same 5,000 people buying art around the world that are getting older, and everyone's wondering what's going to happen, you know, how will we get new collectors, how will we get, you know, additional people coming into this pool of 5,000 people? Well, there's how, you know, for starters, you need to give them the tools.
One reason is the last paragraph here, even though there are evident limits of reliability and objectivity regarding the attribution, the art market recognizes almost exclusively the validity of an expertise it requires before a sale on and/or a purchase. In other words, either you have an attribution or you don't sell it or you don't want to buy it. That's all. And and yet, as I said, let me repeat for the people listening and to the seminar, is that there has to be clear that an attribution, regardless how educated it is, legally, it's an opinion. So if the guy, the scholar, whoever, in good faith, will make a mistake, once you bought a painting that has been attributed and you pay a fortune, and it came out that not only is not by this guy, but it's even worse, it's a fake. It's not that you can go back to the guy and say, now you give me the money back. He is not liable. And this is something that most of the people don't realize. And obviously the people inside the art market, they don't want to publicize this because the whole paradigm will fall apart otherwise, because it's based on attribution. And then authentication. Now, this is something that I wrote several times because it's not easy to really explain in simple terms, and maybe this is one way, but not only the only and the best way. Authentication of artwork can be considered a true investigation. In other words, when we authenticate a work of art, we are addressing, in the best scenario, I like to call it a cold case, okay? In other words, something that has happened some time ago, and you don't know nothing about the case. You have to build up your own leads. You have to find a way to put the pieces together to understand how this was done and why and how and where and so forth. So I call it you need a scientific methodology, but basically it's truly an investigation. Too often I've seen how authentication is seen as a sequence of exams. That's not so. And you must have a methodology in mind that will guide you through, because not only you could be misled, but also, I mean, they're forgers. The production of forgery is industrial today, and they obviously use all the scientific knowledge in order to fool you. And so it's not just a matter of doing your homework as a sequence of exams. You have to, at a certain point, you have to be able to see the whole the issue of the authentication. And once you have gathered all the data, then you have to ask yourself, so what? What do I really have? Too often, these data are presented to potential buyers or even to sellers as a list of data or a list of images. And obviously, you know, let's say the protagonists of the art market are driven away from science because they don't know what to do with it. Because hardly they're given a final answer. And that is the issue on authentication. If you do authentication, you must give a final answer. Otherwise, you're fooling yourself, but worst, you're fooling your client. You're fooling the whole, let's say, the trust that is given to science in order to at least provide objective data. And this is something that it should be addressed more and more, especially to young scientists that would like to get into this field, where you need a methodology, you need an investigative mind, but also you have a moral duty to provide final answers. And if it's not possible, you should plainly say it and explain why not. But not simply, as I've seen too many times, oh, we didn't find anything incompatible with whatever, with a certain time period, then it has to be good. Now, that's naive, if not in bad faith, because this is not the case. You have to bring down the final answer. Is this authentic painting or not? Once you have identified the materials, the technique, you have to study the aging processes. And you need, this is not something you simply measure or you document. You also need the experience and the background and the history of, well, not only of restoration, but material science and art history. And then to put all the pieces together and realize if you are in front of an authentic painting or versus a very well done forgery. Up to now, I have examined over 4,500 paintings.
Wow.
And I can assure you this, I mean, the variety of forgeries is amazing. And it's fascinating at the same time, let me say from my point of view, because always is a challenge. But you need to recognize that there is a crime. And possibly you need to recognize what kind of crime and how that was done. And that the technology alone not always gives you that final answer. It's up to you to put all the leads together and see where you're going. And if all that are antagonized with each other, or instead they're compiling in one final answer. Yes, please.
I was just going to say that the thing to add to that is that there's a challenge in just my work with Maurizio previously. led me to believe that you have to have what amounts to a persistent deal room or a persistent database that allows your predecessor's work to be built upon, right? The research to be built upon. And even, Annika, as you talk about doing like a house inspection, well, it's more valuable to see the previous house inspections as well. Do we have a problem that's brewing? Are the things that were called out as, you don't have to address, but you may need to? Did they actually fix the problem from the last time? There are things that build up over time.
But there's also a question of bias, right? I mentioned the whole, do you want to accept the seller's survey? Well, in 95% of cases in the art world, it's the sellers that are getting the, providing this, a lot of these details, and it could be the buyers that are demanding them, right?
Scientific method provides us guidance on this, right? It becomes peer review, and peer review allows, a primary scientist or researcher to do work and have that backed up. It builds up a legal standard that's higher than an opinion. And I think that should be true for whatever we do, not just the scientific, but it's also the research, provenance, et cetera. And I think we shouldn't just, focus entirely thinking this is only for old masters. This is for everything. If we look at the art world today, we have an opportunity to literally put an ID and protect the authenticity of works of art from the day they're born, to even with, living artists all the way through and work backwards. So not everything is is necessarily, a dead body, a forensic analysis, though a lot of the hard ones are. There's the whole bridge. And if we put value on data, you'll do what manufacturers do now, literally, try and avoid fraud from the beginning, put IDs on them, find ways to track it, find ways to measure it. And once again, we don't know who's going or what works of art are going to be the most valuable 50 years from now. So why don't we establish reasonable, inexpensive standards to be building up that data so that we understand how to conserve them, where the issues are, how to protect the entire industry of, because cultural history is not just in the past, it is forever, growing.
Moving forward, we're almost at the end as far as my part is concerned. I would like to say that there is no legal obligation. If you sell or buy a painting, you're not obliged to get authentication. It's a free choice, because people don't realize the difference between authentication and attribution, as well as let me see what happened. And therefore, they are scholars, they're experts, they come out with attribution, but they themselves, they feel they don't need to go first and to prove that it's authentic. And let me say something sort of straightforward, maybe too straightforward, but how difficult it is for an investor to understand that how important is to buy a work of art attributed, let's say, to Picasso, if you have not proven that it's authentic. I mean, where do you think you're going? You simply are putting your investment at risk, which will never become an asset class because it will retain that risk over and over. And so why do we want to leave, as I wrote here, we leave the ground open for subjective and potentially contradictory interpretation. And this goes on and on everywhere. Please.
I think to Maurizio's point there, I think an analogy is worthwhile. And if somebody were to buy a diamond today and say, would you like to buy this diamond? And I'm only going to tell you about 2 of the 4 C's, your reaction would be, you're kidding me. I know there's 4, tell me about all of them. Yet the art world continues to go along sort of ignoring whatever I choose to tell you is what you get, as opposed to demanding and understanding, this work of art has all of the criteria and it checks off the list, versus other ones are just a lovely story, but it's not verified. And having a way to effectively look across the industry and look across works of art, will fundamentally change it. So that's one of the things we've taken lessons, literally from the GIA, of how we can take what is relatively standard practice in the art world, where we put value on both qualitative and quantitative data, and allow the consumer to actually understand, as Maurizio says, this work of art has actually gone through a rigorous process to establish its authenticity. This work of art has a couple people saying it's by a certain artist with no backing data, scientific proof, etc. So when they die, their opinion's gone with them. And just that information is incredibly useful in terms of how you should look at, any work of art, let alone how you're going to maintain it or preserve it.
Absolutely. I wonder if we should open up for questions for a few minutes. If anyone has a few minutes extra. We're just at time now.
Well, this is my last slide, and I just want to make sure that the audience understand that if we want the art market to grow in a sustainable manner, it needs to be based on foundational international accepted standards. I didn't even touch the subject of standards, but process and quantifiable data. In other words, we need rules. And
you're preaching to the converted here. I've been trying to build an international industry standard in condition reporting for the last 10 years.
Well, yeah, I would like to do on top of that, or together with that, the authentication process.
Absolutely.
Because that is the way to go. Then we talk about attribution. But the attribution that should be based on the objective results provided by the conservation report, but also by the authentication. Otherwise, it's a subjective interpretation. And how difficult it is for a newcomer, for an investor to understand. An investor that could have made billions somewhere else, but when it comes to buy a work of art, he relies only on trust and opinion, which sounds to me, it's incredible to believe, but still, this is what is happening today. Okay.
It is incredible. And one of the companies that Articheck is sometimes compared to, I don't know if you've heard of it, is called Carfax. Have you ever heard of that? It's based in America, and it's very common for people who are buying a used car to require, as a buyer, I want to see the Carfax record, right? That gives you some information and data points on its maintenance, its previous owners, all the kind of practical information that you want to know about a car. And so, yeah, absolutely. Moving forward, we should have the same kind of idea for art.
That was literally the analogy that was shared with me when we started on our venture at Authentify, which was, if you want the background, George Akerlof wrote a economics paper in 1971 called the Market for Lemons. And he basically talked about the dysfunction of the used car market because there was asymmetry of data. Buyers didn't know what sellers knew, or there was just a lack or dearth of information. And it took 10 years after the publishing of that article for the automotive industry to standardize the VIN number that became that ID that we could connect data together. And it was with 2 years from then that Carfax started, and it was actually intent was just eliminating odometer fraud. But just like you're saying, by starting to pull together information around odometer fraud led to bringing in more and more information. And if for those that don't know it, at least in the US, it was about 3 years later that the certified pre-owned car market blossomed, because suddenly there was a way to explain to people what you were having. It increased value and participation in a market that was largely dying or dead. And at the same thing, it's not exactly the same lesson, but in a disaggregated industry, Carfax was pulling information from people that did oil changes and car repairs and everything else. So you could learn about everything now. And the same can actually exist in the art market. And what that does is drive participation, increase value. It does a lot of things. And I think there's a question out here sort of asking about why insurance industry doesn't require authentication. And I think it really just comes down to scalability and cost. If this were something that cost less or were easier to do, of course it'd be demanded there. And I think that's where technology, we're driving towards that it's not every time you look at something, you have to re-authenticate it. It's sort of one and done. The sooner you can do it in the process and establish it, then it becomes persistent. And then over time, it becomes, not just for $1 million works of art, but all the way down to sort of entry-level fine art.
Exactly, which brings me on nicely to the questions that we have here.
Yep.
And we'll just take a few minutes. I know, apologies everyone, I know we're over time, but it was too interesting of a talk and presentation, so I just had to deal with that. But we'll just take a couple of minutes for questions. And the most recent one was on the big cost of scientific analysis. And I think that is a great point, that through technology and through building an infrastructure where we can build a hub, and bring all of this information together and have the history. I mean, that's, again, one of the things I'm always saying about condition reports and Articheck is that one of the benefits and values of embracing a system rather than the traditional method is that with a piece of paper and a pen, you do a condition report for a particular project at a particular moment of time, and so we talk about condition as, the platform is the chain of condition, right? It's tracking liability through the life of something. It's not just one link in the chain, which is what you get from one paper condition report for one project in time. And you always have to start from scratch. There's a lot of duplication of effort, but also you don't have the benefit of the history of the object, as you were mentioning. If you could have that with scientific analysis, if you could have access to the old information, that would be such a fantastic thing. Unfortunately, currently that doesn't really exist until now, right? With you guys.
Yep.
Yep, that's right. It doesn't exist yet.
Unfortunately, just based on time, there's a lot of this stuff is changing very rapidly, and what we've seen in the industry is there's a great deal of very interesting technology out there. But most often, it's technology and data looking for a home. And it's only when we have a home and common platforms and common ways of talking about things that it actually has true value. And I think there's a way to drive towards standardization without it having to be a monopoly of one person declaring the standard and everybody has to follow. There's clearly a way of bringing in, I'm sure many of the people on this call and elsewhere that can contribute to this, want to contribute to this, can collaborate, and can drive change very, very rapidly. And for those that haven't followed, I see we're sort of at this interesting, fascinating, quintessential time. Things have changed so rapidly over the past 5 years, let alone the past 45 years. And there's a gentleman, if you ever look it up, his name is Bran Ferren, and he does this one interesting TED Talk about the most influential thing in his life was when he saw the Pantheon. And he talks about the 5 miracles that led to the Pantheon. Like the Pantheon itself wasn't necessarily a miracle, it was just a major innovation, but it was based on a whole range of miracles that made it happen. And in the sort of the contemporary version, people are looking at autonomous vehicles. There's a whole bunch of things from GPS to navigation systems to high-speed internet to cellular capabilities to AI drives what amounts to the sort of miracle of innovation. And I think, I don't want to overstate it, but I think the art world, the same thing is happening. There's access to information, technology that would take, months and years is now catching up to, hours to minutes. There's an opportunity to share data in a secure, selective way. There's a way for us to interact and identify works of art using, computer technology in your phone that didn't exist years ago. Like there's just this massive opportunity to bring it together to create what I think will be a sort of miracle and renaissance in the art world in terms of how we approach it, how we look at it, how we collaborate, and how we pull this disaggregated, marketplace of information as well as, people buying and selling, and bring it together in a way that elevates art, in my opinion, to where it belongs. It belongs to be considered at the same level of every other asset class out there, but having its own sort of add-on value of having, cultural value that puts it even above. But I think it requires, and I don't think it's, as I say, it's a bunch of innovations that get brought together to create this ultimate miracle.
So let me just do 1 or 2 more questions, and then I guess we should stop there. Although I'm really enjoying this conversation, I have to say, but I know we're over time. One is from Catherine Baker. Are you aware of any institutions that currently fundraise in this manner? I think she's referring to our earlier discussion around micro donations, kind of democratizing fundraising for conservation. And the art, I will say the Art Fund has done crowdfunding for specifically conservation projects, or is in the process of doing it. They've done crowdfunding for museums, and I know that they have plans, if they haven't done it already, to crowdfund for conservation projects specifically. We have plans to partner with the likes of yourselves and also another platform that will create this between us, the ability to do this. And I'm really excited about that possibility. So if you're interested, please be in touch with me and I can tell you more about it. It's something that we're developing for the future. I think to that point, if you want to another point, we could always just do sort of a more sort of tech show and tell. Happy to come back and show some of those things, because I think it'll be exciting for people. Just the ideas that we keep getting from people of different innovations that I think can help the entire art world. Absolutely. And one last thing I think we should kind of end on the note on perhaps is why, from Valerie Kincaid, why does the insurance industry not require authentication rather than just accepting attribution? So my opinion about why that might be, and I'm not an insurance expert, especially not in US insurance. I know Valerie is based in the US, but I think it's probably because the market is very soft, because I have had the conversation a lot with insurers about why they haven't required always condition reports. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. Sometimes the requirements are not for, you know, very good, let's say, condition reports. And so I know that the market has been very soft over the last 5 years. Premiums have been at an all-time low. Requirements have also been at an all-time low in terms of what their customers have to do. And this is changing, however. I know that the market is firming up. I know that increases to premiums are coming, and increases to requirements for terms are coming. I'm currently in negotiation with a bunch of insurers about requiring ArtEcheck in the future. So, you know, these things are happening. It's kind of a question of time.
I think if you follow the money, the only time this is going to fundamentally change is where you're insuring the value, and that's going to be more from non-recourse loans in the art finance area. So when a bank is no longer requiring that your balance sheet match the artwork, that it's the art that holds its value, is where that's going to drive that fundamental change. And it's going to drive the insurance companies to also say, well, in order for us to take this as pure collateral without recourse, you know, then we have to, you know, go through multiple steps. And that same thing is going to happen if, you know, true art exchanges start existing, you know, not just fractional shares of crap, but, you know, if they take it seriously and want to elevate it to that highest level, that's where these rules will start to change, because then the asset is standing on its own, and that will fundamentally drive, you know, the requirements around, you know, authenticity. And that's the
I had to have one NFT question on there. NFT is so hot right now. So does the advent of non-fungible art offer some new opportunities for developing authentication methodologies? And I would say, yes, it does. I mean, at AIS, we have a working subgroup that is just focused on NFTs from the legal working group. So definitely.
I think the best way to look at it is as an anti-fraud mechanism, of which, you know, the blockchain and smart contracts themselves are very effective. And it's a way to both store and protect the provenance, not just of a work of art, but the data associated with it, and thus establishing, you know, the value, what is known, what is true about it, and that giving that persistence over time. As well as, you know, forcing people to, when they weigh in on something, there's not this sort of great caveat that says, you know, in my opinion, you know, assuming it's, you know, authentic, et cetera. It's like, no. If you're going to weigh in on it, you know, there has to be a higher legal standard of when people actually, you know, go out and voice their opinion, or it's just, you know, it's just smack talk as far as I'm concerned. You know, it's like, you know, it's just, you know, it's as valuable as a politician's words, right? It doesn't hold much.
Well, what a great way to end about smack talk. Sorry, Maurizio, you were going to say something?
I was saying that since 5-6 years ago, I heard about this new way to make absolutely safe the any data with blockchain, which is correct. But the issue here is not the technology, it's how reliable the data that you put inside blockchain are. And if they're not derived from a strict methodology and real science, then you can, the market will not change. Even when you will simply continue to have a due diligence that has been forged, the painting has been forged.
Well, this is why I say this is exactly why AIS should exist, because the whole idea there is building up that investigation analysis that you mentioned in the first place, right? If you have an ID, you want to buy an artwork, you want to do your due diligence, you find the ID, you search for it, you find, okay, there's a dozen different trusted third parties who have posted information on a public and a private layer, you know, associated with this work. I can see that it was exhibited at a major museum 5 years ago, and if I want to see the condition report, then I can pay a fee and I can see that. oh, I see it was sold at Sotheby's 20 years ago. And if I pay a fee, I can see for how much, and the details of the sale. Oh, you know, I see that it had forensic analysis 3 years ago. And if I pay a fee, I can see the results of that. Once you have these trusted third parties posting details about work, then you can start to build a picture, and you can start to make, you know, a reasonable analysis based on that. On the other hand, if you do a search and you see that there's, you know, one person from a random place who's not even an art world professional is making some kind of crazy allegations about this work, you can say to yourself, well, that's not a good sign, right? Sure. So I think that's exactly the reason that we need these kinds of hubs and tools for aggregated data.
The one thing that I think, you know, Maurizio is pointing out, though, is it's still relatively easy to launder bad data. And that's a requirement that, and you sort of allude to it, is the standard by which people are putting on, you know, data, you know, associated with the work of art. They themselves, to some degree, should be, you know, authenticated or, you know, authentified, as we say. You know, identify the individual, you know, authenticate the, you know, the veracity of the data, and basically hold them accountable to it. You know, have it notarized, et cetera. You know, make it raise the legal standard by which people are weighing in on it. You know, it creates some friction, but it also, for the people that have done the real work, that have the good research, that have this data, it elevates everything else, and that's more important.
Absolutely, that makes good sense.
Well,
Last comment has to do with my type of profession. In order to spread the idea of authentication, you also need to bring a new breed of scientists specialized in authentication. And I can speak for Italy. There is no such a place where a young a graduate, let's say, in physics, in chemistry, or in engineering, in biology, could get this kind of training because there are no such schools, and universities, they don't prepare this kind of new professionals. So this is also another issue. There is a growing need for science to move in, but I don't see where this new scientist could come from. And yet I see a lot of young kids graduated in different fields of science that they would like very much to learn, but they don't know where to go.
I agree. I think that is a definite need for the future. I think in the arts, you know, digital marketing is another area that's so important for the arts. And in order to, again, facilitate getting funds for these kinds of projects, in order to pay these new professionals in forensics that we so badly need. And so, yeah, I think that there's going to be, people worry, actually, in terms of art and technology and this whole conversation, a lot of people worry, you know, is technology going to take my job? And I think the answer is absolutely not. But what it will do is your job potentially, or the jobs of people in the art world, will evolve, you know, along with this process. And actually what it will mean is people working more deeply and more interestingly, if anything. They'll be able to, for the first time, you know, uncover new kind of levels and layers of research, you know, that bringing all of these things together, all of these tools together in one place will facilitate.
Yep.
So, yeah, I really hope that there will be some institutions that will take this on in the future.
I think the key is ultimately going to be private money funding, you know, overall research, and I think there's a path, and I think there's a path to drive significantly more engagement. And less sort of sociopathic, you know, you're going to restore the painting the way I like it, and more general information and general research into improving the overall field. And from my conversations in the banking, insurance, and a couple other areas, I think there's a massive opportunity, and I think we're on the cusp of a major change that's going to happen in the next 2 years.
Great. Well, here's to that. Thank you so much for both of your time and your effort and your passion and enthusiasm. I'm really excited to work with you on trying to realize this vision over the coming years, and I hope that our audience is, you know, supportive of that.
Great.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you so much.
Take care. Bye.